I'm Brett Hayworth, and welcome to What's the Frequency, our weekly show on Siouxland Public Media. We are at the one-year anniversary of a huge natural disaster that changed the arc of summer 2024 for so many people. Heavy rains in northwest Iowa and South Dakota on June 20th to 22nd really delivered a wallop to such rivers as the Big Sioux and Little Sioux. Siouxlanders had to deal with a variety of trying situations as rivers and lakes rose, with highways having several days of closures. Emergency management leaders in counties across the region worked to keep their communities safe. In the initial days, people were flooded out of homes in such places as Correctionville, Spencer, Cherokee, Rock Valley, and Haywarden in northwest Iowa, plus North Sioux City and South Dakota. Then the cleanup began, which was a very daunting task for people. Some people's homes were a total loss, others lost wings of their homes, or items in their basements were ruined. That sort of devastation also happened in businesses. Not only were neighbors helping, but also some government agencies were giving aid, both locally and nationally. The Federal Emergency Management Agency was opening a series of disaster recovery centers in Siouxland. At those centers, recovery specialists from FEMA and the U.S. Small Business Administration provided information on available services, explained assistance programs, and helped survivors complete or check the status of their applications. And now the recovery continues at the one-year mark. On June 10th, about a week ago, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds came to Rock Valley for a ribbon cutting on a housing development where some flooding victims are already moving in. Rock Valley Mayor Kevin von Otterloo said the town is recovering, rebuilding, and ready for what's next, adding, quote, "I want to acknowledge that many in our community are still hurting, still searching for answers, and are still rebuilding their lives. Please know that you are not forgotten," unquote, von Otterloo said. Spencer in Clay County, Iowa was also hard hit by flooding. That's where I'm at to talk with town residents and also government officials about how the year has played out, from the worst of the Little Sioux River flooding brunt to the initial days of recovery once the river receded, and now the pursuit of intermediate and longer range work, which will continue much past the one-year flooding anniversary on June 20th. At Spencer City Hall for this What's the Frequency show, I am joined by two people who have had key roles in navigating the Little Sioux River flooding aftermath. Those are Spencer City Manager Kevin Robinson and Clay County Emergency Management Coordinator Eric Tegas. Thank you both for joining me. We have a lot of topics to address, but I guess I want to start with, let's go with this. What is the mood of the people now, 1 year later in Spencer, and how are people in Spencer feeling?
I think when an event, the level of the event that occurred on June 22nd happens in a community, it sets people on many different types of trajectories as they move forward. So there were people who were absolutely significantly impacted, financially devastated, emotionally devastated. And then you have people who had a moderate impact, on their property or in their lives. And I would say the level of impact that happened on that day continues to impact their recovery and trajectory today, a year later. Some people lost their homes completely. Some people were able to rebuild and repair their homes. Some people are still in the process of trying to figure out how to repair, rebuild their property. The South business commercial sector got hit significantly hard, downtown businesses. The basements flooded, and so a lot of businesses downtown lost inventory. On the north end of town, businesses were significantly impacted. Some on the north end had 5-6 foot of water in them, lost everything in there. We've seen an amazing recovery and resiliency. I would guesstimate that on the commercial side of things, 85 to 90% of the businesses have reinvested back in their property and businesses. And then on the residential side, we had about 70% of our town was impacted by either sanitary sewer backup and or river flooding. And there's only 40 properties that are on the FEMA buyout list. So again, on the residential side, tremendous impact, but people are resilient on that side as well.
I agree with Kevin, and there was a lot of resiliency. There was a lot of people just kind of digging in after a significant life changing impact. I mean, this is one of those defining moments of the community. One of those things that's everything is split before and after June 22nd from now on, and so I think that there's a lot of resiliency, a lot of digging in and getting to work. Um, a lot of community pride, and but I think also looking to us, the city leaders, about how do we make adjustments, and how do we, what does this threat and what does this risk look like going forward?
Thank you for that, Eric Tegas. And I guess next question, as we sit here in the City Hall in Spencer, How would you rate yourself, or I guess, or the government officials over the last year as for how the recovery has gone and delivery of services?
Well, I think that there is no grade to give. There's just every day you wake up and try to give your best effort. And so things that we've tried to do is monetary support. The first thing you find out, there's never enough dollars to fix the damage that occurred. You just try to figure out where are the resources that you can assemble to put money towards specific projects. And we did a few of those. We can talk about them later through the interview. And then on the human side of it, one of the key elements to moving past the immediate critical response is the long-term response. So this morning we had a partner meeting with the long-term recovery group, and there's folks in town here who've assembled a long-term recovery group. You see those in every significant disaster town, and so they're focused on the unmet needs of those people moving forward, trying to repair their homes and patch their lives back together. So I don't know that I would give us a number rating. What I would say is that we look at the threat of weather and the threat of natural disasters different today than we did before. We're trying to put resources together that we didn't use before. An example would be the Iowa Flood Center. So, we knew about the Iowa Flood Center, but I wouldn't say we had a deep relationship with them. And we've worked a lot with them on the flood modeling. We've requested 3 different weather stations upriver so we can get a better look upriver. We can shrink our time notification, meaning that previously we were relying on models that gave 12 and 24-hour updates. You wonder how a flash flood happens. Well, a flash flood happens in a quicker window than 12 hours. And so the Iowa Flood Center is able to deliver us data every 15 minutes. We feel in the future we'll be better off to be able to help predict the immediacy of flooding. And we also learned, nobody in leadership now saw this river system at the level that it was on June 22nd. So we understand more now about our community and how flooding impacts our community. And there's a lot of attention gets paid to the Little Sioux River. There's actually 3 systems, if you will, that impact Spencer, Iowa. There's the Ocheyedan River that comes in from the west side of town. There's the Little Sioux River that comes down from the north side of town. Also, the Iowa Great Lakes chain empties into the Little Sioux. And then the Ocheyedan and the Little Sioux converge just about 200 yards west of the bridge downtown over Highway 71 and 18. And so, from a floodplain management, we're looking at really 3 different things. You're looking at the Ocheyedan River system, you're looking at the Little Sioux River system, then you're looking at that combined convoluence of both of those. And in the event of June 22nd, both of those flood basins were saturated. There was no more room left. The rain pattern happened over both flood system or both collection systems. And so that's how the dramatic swift impact, hit Spencer. And now we know we need to pay attention to that and look at that. And so we've moved our monitoring of flooding upstream, if you will. We've put different simplified levels of risk in place, level 1, 2, 3, with different color codes. We'll launch that here later this month. We've got an application that's available in the app and Google Store that'll be a primary just city communication tool, but then a component of that also is weather related. And the gauges on the river system feed in live into that system. We'll be able to push notify people of what level we're in from a threat perspective and what level we're nearing. So one thing that we found through this last disaster was people really relied on their local government to tell them definitive things to do and when to do them. And what we want to do is really be able to empower them to make their own decisions and let them know here's where you're at from a risk standpoint, here's where the prediction of risk is. Be prepared to make your own decisions. And so that's one of the big takeaways from this event is trying to get people data as early as we can, as accurate as we can, and let them be able to make their own decisions.
I mean, I think that, it just and for obvious reasons, the damage in of the June 22nd flooding, was the media capture was Spencer, Iowa, right? Because this is where the population base of Clay County is. This is where we took the far and away the most significant hit. But when you go to a county perspective, I mean, the community of Everly, the community of Jelly Grove, the community of Peterson were all impacted by the Little Sioux River. Lots of rural properties were impacted by the same flooding that impacted the community of Spencer. And so from a county perspective, we had to divide and conquer a little bit on bringing resources to bear, um, in the outlying areas as well, which was difficult. And then secondly, I think, but and Kevin touched on this. It's okay. This happened, and what can we do? What experts can we leverage? What information can we learn in an after action style report that tells us how we can do it better next time? And so I think that the Spencer app is a product of that. The ongoing conversation, the coordination between county officials and city officials, are all direct results of just how can we do this better. And so yeah, we're more prepared today than we were June 21st for sure.
This episode of What's the Frequency is checking in on the 1-year anniversary of the devastating Siouxland floods that happened in June 2024. It wasn't just Northwest Iowa, but also Southeast South Dakota as well, in North Sioux City and other areas. My guests currently here at Spencer City Hall are City Manager Kevin Robinson and Clay County Emergency Management Coordinator Eric Tegas. And for those who have monitored the Little Sioux River, for those who have paid attention to flooding over the years, you know that when the Little Sioux goes out of its banks, there's going to be a lot of downstream flooding in kind of the same towns over and over. Spencer, for you guys here, of course, Peterson, Iowa, further down, Cherokee, and then Correctionville, closer to Sioux City. But what I guess I don't know is, was the crest, how high was the river this time in Spencer, and was it a record high?
So what we do know is it was the highest recorded crest. So 1953 was the second highest recorded crest at just over 20 feet, and this was just over 22 feet.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was Spencer City Manager Kevin Robinson. Next, I want to go, as we discuss the 2024 huge flooding event throughout Siouxland. We had so many news items that we aired at Siouxland Public Media, and I just want to share a few of them here ahead. And I'll start first with June 24th, 2024. Widespread flooding continues to impact Siouxland for a third consecutive day as the Big Sioux River reached a record level through Sioux City, and a mandatory evacuation of some Riverside area homes was ordered Monday morning. The Big Sioux River crested at a new record level of 46 feet at 8 a.m. Monday, above the prior record of 37.7 feet. Sioux City officials have opened the Tyson Event Center for people in the Riverside area needing a place to shelter. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds at 9:30 a.m. began a day of touring many flooded Northwest Iowa counties, with plans to visit Hawarden, Rock Rapids, Rock Valley, Spencer, and Cherokee. The latter two towns have been flooded by the Little Sioux River. The flooding in Northwest Iowa resulted in state and federal highways 6, 9, 18, and 71, plus others being closed down from Saturday to Monday. A National Weather Service official said Northwest Iowa and adjacent localized areas received about 10 inches of rain over a short time, and that moisture is now working its way through river systems downstream. There's also a concern that the forecast calls for heavier rain precipitation later this week. Iowa's Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, John Benson, said the situation is serious and will continue to blossom. Quote, "This flood is not over. Right now, everything you see in Northwest Iowa is being dumped into the Missouri River. If you look at the river gauges in Missouri, they are going up, and they are going to go up quickly," unquote, Benson said. And now a question, on the heels of that, and as we look back to those very initial days, what did you know would be coming in terms of weather impact, and how did the expectation of what that might be compared to how it actually was on June 20th, 21st, 22nd in those first initial worst days?
Sure, I can answer that first. So the prediction and the preparation combined together. So the prediction by the National Weather Service was a pretty much replica event of what happened in 2019. So that crest level was predicted. The timing of that was late Sunday, which would be June 23rd. So the plans were put in place to match the response that we did for that event. And so we'd seen that level before. We were comfortable with that. We knew how to respond to that. And then what occurred was a crest on Saturday morning early. Predicted crest was late Sunday. The predicted crest was under 18. So it was about 17 and a half. And the actual crest was about 22 and a half. And so another thing you learn during flooding events is nobody has a crystal ball. So once a river system eclipses its predicted crest, you just don't know. You just don't know how much more is coming. What you do know is it's more than what was predicted. And if you think of flooding events, water rises and then it spreads out. And then when that capacity gets full, it starts to rise again, and then it spreads out and disperses, and then that pattern just keeps happening. And so from a floodplain perspective, all floodplains are identified by elevation. So LIDAR, radar, elevation of ground, 100-year, 500-year, you hear these terms. Inundation model flooding is really the modeling of what actually happens with water. And that's what you're seeing things move towards now is an inundation model. So we lived an inundation model. So for example, things flooded that we had not anticipated flooding because we'd never modeled and looked at what happens if, river levels get that high, right? And part of why we didn't is that's an atypical, that was a 4 to 5,000 year event is what it was rated at. So you typically don't spend a lot of time modeling what ifs that are that far over, 100, 500-year type flood. And then once it does happen, you scramble. Maybe Eric can talk a little bit about this, but in our planning, which is solid planning, everywhere we'd identified as a shelter for people to go was flooded. And so then you start scrambling. If you can imagine, yeah, the emergency operations center had to move because City Hall started to flood. Our fire station flooded, our police station flooded, our 911 system went down due to complications from flooding. And so all of these chain of events, not only are they happening, they're happening simultaneous to neighborhoods and areas flooding and needed evacuating that you have not planned for, because who would have ever thought that water would get to, X intersection, right? And then logistics become a huge issue. Not only logistics in outlying areas, but just logistics in town. We were cut off in this particular town, how it's laid out north and south. So your emergency services sit on the north side of the river. And when that gets cut off, you don't have emergency services on the south side. And we had rapid evacuations. We had 600 to 800 boat rescues, we estimate, and immediate boat rescues. And so these are people leaving without shoes, without their medications on Saturday morning. Yeah. So you're leaving your property, some of them out kitchen windows into a boat, and you don't have shoes, you don't have your medications, you grab your pet, you don't have your CPAP, and then everything ends up in buildings that got designated as shelters. And then you go through a consolidation period. At one time, there were 7 different shelters set up. And so then you try to manage that and you try to consolidate your resources down over time. We ended up with one within, I think maybe 4 or 5 days, but, these are all things that you typically don't plan for that occurred, again, when a event at a 4,000-year level hits your community. And so you scramble and do the best you can.
Sure. So, and Kevin did a great job of explaining, the what was forecasted versus the reality. And the Iowa Flood Center did a wonderful job of kind of doing an after action report, and spoke at a community outreach meeting that we had here. And he talked about in that meeting, how so far out on the chart this event proved to be, and how there was nobody that was going to forecast to the 0.8% chance. And that's what this was it was so far out of the norm. From a response standpoint, um, obviously it's very difficult when all of the infrastructure that you rely on, city hall, county administration building, county courthouse, fire department, police department, communications center, all of those things are taken away from you in the first 3 hours of this event. And so, yeah, now your work is a lot harder. And so, but our responders worked tirelessly. And we made we made audibles, and we pivoted, and we moved, and we made adjustments as we needed to. And those first 72 hours were a lot, and it was difficult and hard work, and there was no sleep, and you just stayed at it. But yeah, I mean, you have plans that involve shelter locations and communications, and again, all of those things are taken away. So then you make adjustments and you move on. And so we had 500 plus people in shelters that first night. And and Kevin touched on this as well, that there was north of the river and south of the river. Not only was there north of the river and south of the river, but you couldn't get to Spencer for a time, and so bringing in resources was difficult. And so we made some really good moves early on where we kind of split our resources. So we had first responders on the south side of the river and the north side of the river. That was a key move that happened early on, and paid benefits for us. But then, I mean, we sheltered for 27 days. And so, yeah, the ongoing recovery stuff was, in those first few weeks, was the bulk of our time.
This episode of What's Its Frequency is delving into the 1-year anniversary of the devastating Siouxland floods of June 2024. Those impacted not only Northwest Iowa, but also Southeast South Dakota. And my guests currently here at Spencer City Hall are City Manager Kevin Robinson and Clay County Emergency Management Coordinator Eric Tegas. I want to read one more news account that we ran at Siouxland Public Media. This was from August 2024, about 2 months after the June flooding took place. Rebounding from damaging situations caused by substantial summer flooding continues in Siouxland. In Vermilion, South Dakota, the City Council is working to replace all 3 sanitary sewer force mains which were damaged beyond repair by the flooding. Another flood-related expense could run to about $140,000 in Spencer, Iowa. Residents removed a huge number of damaged home and personal possessions, and at one point those were trucked to the Clay County Fairgrounds. Those items significantly damaged the fairgrounds parking lot, so the Spencer City Council on Monday began working to get an asphalt repair in time for the highly popular fair in September. Just like in Vermilion, Spencer officials are checking to see if the parking lot repair cost is reimbursable by FEMA. In related news, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds on Tuesday announced the first round of awards that will enable people to build 175 homes in disaster-impacted towns. That money comes from the State Disaster Recovery New Housing Grant Program, and it will go for projects in such towns as Cherokee, Crescent, Minden, Rock Rapids, Rock Valley, and Spencer. And as I just shared in that, we at Siouxland Public Media, in the many days after the flooding, tried to keep up with all the things that were happening with flood-related actions by the state, and then also like the local governments like yourself here at the Spencer City Council. So we looked at all the news agendas, and we kept up with what we thought were the important things as I just described there. And now as we sit here 1 year later, what would you say are the most immediate, important, upcoming steps that need to be taken towards recovery? And let's go with you first, City Manager Kevin Robinson from Spencer.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm personally not a huge fan of the term recovery. Moving forward to me is really more in line with what happens in a disaster community where you have these different things. So there's residential, neighborhood implications, there's commercial business implications, there's city government implications. And so if you start to break each of those down, they all have different needs and they all have different programs that will fund into them to repair, fix, move forward. I would say that we currently are in the process, obviously past our critical needs. So food, water, safety, shelter, we're past that. People have made financial decisions on their properties and businesses, whether they're putting them in the buyout program or they're fixing them or listing them for sale or so. That process has happened and is in I would say probably the kind of final chapters of those decisions. Now we're moving more towards long-term strategic planning. And so you start to weigh in the probability game of what are you going to try to protect in the future? What are you going to try to prevent from happening again? What are you going to try to just be prepared for? So if you break that down, take just a residence, for example. So we live in the Midwest. Most towns have basements. Most of your critical infrastructure is in the basement. And so if you just start at the residential level, there's things you can do to mitigate your property from large damage in the future. So you can take your electrical box system and move it upstairs. You can know where the floodplain is. You know where the water was this time. You can move things up, right? From a community protection standpoint, now we move into engineering studies and how funding for, I'm going to call it residential and commercial property mitigation works is you put together ideas of how to protect those different areas, and then you come up with a dollar amount for that. And then the grant programs are typically rated by the amount of assets that get protected versus the amount of capital is required to protect those things. And then that determines your rating of eligibility on grant funding. And I would just give the perspective of Cedar Rapids. So 2008 was their large flood. They've had one close to that after that, but 2008 was their big one. And they're still not 100% through their flood wall mitigation system. So flood resiliency 17 years later. And so flood resiliency and recovery is a long-term thing. And that's what we're in the beginning phases of. So we're in the end phases of the initial disaster. So our properties that are in the buyout program will be demoed sometime between now and the end of the calendar year. You'll see those go down. And really, once those properties are down, then you're into 2026. And that's when like a couple different commercial apartment complexes will be bid back out to be rebuilt and things of that nature. So you'll still see 2026. Things are happening in the repair and recovery of the 2024 disaster. But then that's about the final chapter of that initial impact. And then you start talking long term from there. And as far as FEMA goes, we have an estimated $12 million worth of public damage. So this would be like our wastewater treatment plant, lift stations, parks, things of that nature. And we have yet to receive a dollar. So that process is incredibly long, and the scrutiny of eligibility of items is incredibly convoluted, if you will. And one of the biggest variables is the FEMA personnel change out every 3 to 4 months. So you get a new batch of people come in, and then they got to learn everything and the relationships and the projects. And the Trump administration announced last week or 2 weeks ago, they're going to end FEMA, whatever that means. And so now we're in this wind down phase of our disaster where we don't even have any funding yet. And typically that's all handled by FEMA. And so we've been told that the total dollars allocated towards disaster recovery efforts shouldn't be incredibly different. It's the delivery of that. But our difficulty is we're on the back end of that. So we're in this transition phase of FEMA as it's structured.
Thank you, City Manager Kevin Robinson, for that explanation. And so you have $12 million of potential projects to be reimbursed to the city, and you've had $5 million that you've paid out of pocket from the city budget. Where did that money come from? Many cities certainly don't have a, a flooding budget item that they can just draw out of.
We had enough cash reserves to handle that, but we're up against the point where we need to start. Well, I put a hold on all damaged projects we applied for if they were not obligated to be fixed and approved, just so we didn't burn through more cash. But it's not uncommon, and you don't have to look past this town to find public entities that had to borrow money to do recovery efforts on their properties. And then, to a taxpayer, a cash dollar versus a borrowed dollar has a significant difference. Once you have to bond and put interest on that, it has a significant impact to the taxpayer. And then we're thankful to the governor of the state of Iowa. we asked and pushed for some creative funding for commercial businesses because they could not get FEMA assistance. And if they did get small business assistance, it was typically through loans, which they didn't want to put more debt on their balance sheets. And we had ARPA money left over from COVID, 1.3 million, and we had that obligated on a bridge replacement project. And worked with the governor's office to de-obligate that local money. They obligated state money to that bridge. Then we re-obligated 1.3 million into commercial assistance for businesses, and those grants have gone out. They were $5 to $25,000 grants, and then our local utility also matched that 1.3 million. So 2.6 million was injected back into the community, and then we also did about $750,000 worth of micro grants that we had from cash reserves for people who had a red X painted on their house, people who needed right-of-way repair out front, rental properties. We gave $1,500 grants to repair rental properties and things of that nature. So,
And then City Manager Kevin Robinson, as you're describing those buyouts that are coming in Spencer, could you describe where, like what part of town those are located?
so the heaviest hit was the southwest side of town. Southeast was also significantly impacted, and then there's a handful, 5 or less properties on the north side of town that'll be in what qualifies as a buyout property. So this is gonna be a property, A, it flooded, B, it's in the floodplain, and then part of the strategic position of the federal government is to either remove those properties or get the base flood elevation, the first living floor, a foot above the 100-year floodplain. And so we did not mandate anyone or request anyone or try to influence anyone to put their properties in this program. It was completely selective on their own part, and we had about 40 properties that entered that. So it's really a way to. The downside is it reduces your housing stock. The upside is it mitigates future damage from happening on a property if it were to flood again.
For this episode of What's a Frequency, I'm in Spencer, Iowa. I'm talking with city officials and other people about the flooding recovery that's happened 1 year later. June 2024 was a series of devastating floods throughout Siouxland, and a lot of activity happened in Spencer, so that's why I'm here. My current guests are Spencer City Manager Kevin Robinson and Clay County Emergency Management Coordinator Eric Tegas. As you were just describing a few seconds ago, Mr. Robinson, you're making me think of the areas, how things have changed over the years in towns that get frequently flooded. I think of playing baseball when I was a kid in Cherokee, Iowa, and there was ballparks that were near the Little Sioux River. Those have been moved out, and other changes have been made. Some homes have moved away from the river that in there. Has that sort of thing been happening in Spencer? I know that you have a riverfront trail in Spencer. I'm wondering if that was where maybe some homes were, and now there's a trail there instead as people were moved out.
Yeah, Spencer's a little different in the sense that it's not a traditional floodplain shelf that you would find adjacent to a river like Cherokee. So our floodplain is really more of a bowl on the south end of town. Think of it like an old oxbow area coming off of a river system. It's fairly complex. So in a particular neighborhood, you'll have 100, 500, and out of the floodplain areas just based on subtle elevation differences within that neighborhood. Most of the south end of town here was built out in the 1970s with USDA economic development grants for builders. So there really isn't much residential area developed up until the mid 70s. And mid 70s through the 90s is when 85% of the south end of town was built out, again with federal grants. And the floodplain system by the federal government came in 1981. So most of those properties were built prior to the flood insurance program starting and we being designated as a floodplain community. So now you're in this conundrum of having a pretty significant residential build out in an area that after it was built got designated as a 100-year floodplain. Now, what is the long-term strategy of what you do as a community moving forward? Those are the discussions that we'll be having.
The Clay County Long-Term Recovery Group has been tasked with unmet needs. and we have a very dedicated staff that have been working ever since the flood. As Kevin talked about, there's phases, right? There's phases in this event, and we are. I 100% agree with City Manager Robinson in that we are in the very early stages of the long term. What does Spencer look like 30 years from now? Conversation. But the long-term recovery group is still addressing those unmet needs. There are still communities, or some sorry, there are still houses in Spencer that need basement walls repaired, that need sheetrock done, and appliances replaced, and all kinds of things like that. And so our long term recovery group, they work with NGO and non government organizations, bringing in funding and resources that our local community can access, and that's a Clay County wide access. And so if you live in Everly or if you live in Peterson, and you had damage as a direct result of the June 22nd event, you can come speak with the long term recovery group and get access to resources. And we're very proud of the group. They work really hard for us, and I don't think that. They won't be going anywhere in the short term. Certainly, again, this recovery process is going to take some time. And so, Sharifa Jones, who is our chamber director, Sharifa is kind of oversees that staff.
It's standard protocol in disaster communities to have a long-term recovery group, and the state of Iowa, the Homeland Security Division in Iowa deals with disasters. And so part of the protocol post-disaster is that they will help you set up a long-term recovery group. And the groups tend to mirror the needs and talents, if you will, and resources of the communities they're in. So no one LTRG is going to look exactly like another one. And the beauty part of assembling local resources is it's local, but they're connected in through the stratification of disaster relief, which is to say that somebody needs something at their property, it's an unmet need. They first have to go through what's called case advocacy, meaning they have to have a FEMA individual assistance case. It has to be vetted and approved by a case advocate manager, and then it rolls into the long-term recovery group. So that the long-term recovery group is part of a component of a bigger system of recovery for people.
It's a it's a cut. Kevin and I serve on it. There's a gal, Brittany Speaker, who works very hard with one of our local community housing organizations, is the chair of it. And then yeah, just people from the community who serve on the board, and then we have some staff that work every day on meeting those unmet needs.
I really appreciate the conversation that we're having here in Spencer, 1 year later, looking back on Siouxland flooding from June 2024. Before I let you go, any other point that you want to make, or any question that I haven't asked that you think a key point that people should know about the flooding in Spencer that happened, and what lies ahead?
For me, I'm really excited about the Spencer app that's going to be coming out, about finding ways that we can interact and improve communications in the community. We look forward to working with the Iowa Flood Center and the state legislature on the development of hydro stations across northwest Iowa. If you look at the maps of the state of Iowa and the hydro stations that already exist, and a hydro station, for those who don't know, is just a location where they can monitor ground saturation. It can monitor rainfall. And so one of the takeaways was certainly that not only was this a very unique event, but we didn't have, we being the experts, right, the hydrologists, didn't have the data that they could have used to maybe have at least foreseen a little bit more of the impact. And so, if you look at the maps of the hydro stations, obviously there's a greater history of flooding in eastern Iowa and southern Iowa. And so they already have kind of a built out network of hydro stations. And northwest Iowa is just a big blank on the map. There's no hydro station to be found in northwest Iowa, period. And so we've worked with the state legislature about finding ways to address that and finding funding sources to bring hydro stations statewide, which again, if you know that the ground is 98% saturated, and then you experience 2 inches of rain, a hydrologist can do a formula and say, well, hey, an inch and a half of that is going to be runoff into the rivers and streams. And so then that helps calculate what flood projections and flood crests look like, and the reality is that we don't have that data today. And so finding better ways to communicate and finding ways to gather better, more accurate data, are 2 big takeaways that we really hope to address in the next couple of years.
I would just leave you with the perspective of what we heard from the immediate critical response organizations that came to the community in the area after the disaster occurred. And the constant thing that we heard was they were so taken back by how positive everybody was who was impacted and how neighbors helped neighbors and just a tremendous overall community spirit of moving forward through the level of events that we had. And they said that, you don't typically find that in all of the communities that they serve. And, you understand once you go through something like this, there are just a deluge of organizations that come to an area that's incredibly impacted. Everything from people who provide food, people who provide assistance mucking and cleaning out houses, people who provide laundry services, people who provide shelter, like all these resources come into the community and they follow disasters all around the country. And that was the biggest, most consistent piece of feedback that we received was just I think, kind of a reflection of the Midwest, get it done. One phrase that they had mentioned to me one time was a lot of people have said, well, somebody's got it worse than I do. And they said, you don't typically hear that, in a disaster area, but just this, I think, Midwest humble bootstrap, you know, clean your property and your neighbor's property up and move forward.
Before I left Spencer to end this What's a Frequency show, I spoke down in the South Business area with Karen Uveling as she took a break from work. Her basement received 5 inches of flooding last summer. Thank you for talking to me today, Karen. Tell me, what part of town do you live in, and what sort of flood? How did the flooding impact you a year ago?
Well, I live in West 4th, 5th Street, West 4th, or 5th Street, 812 West 5th Street. And that little area acquired a lot of flooding. Our basement got 5 feet of water, and so did the neighbors' basements and stuff like that. And we lost everything in the basement. Basement was part of our living space. We had bedroom and living room and bathroom downstairs, and the locked by that.
Okay, and how long had you lived there?
We lived there since '92. And no, I'm sorry. My mind is on since 2019.
Okay,
Since 2019.
but you've lived in Spencer and other places, though. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I know some people had to be evacuated really quickly by boat. What was your how were you able to get out when the flood actually?
Staying person. He was gonna stay no matter what. That's his house. So he didn't feel he was in danger of any sort. Just the basement was gone basically, and the ground floor was good, so he stayed there. But some of the other people did have embarrassing and stuff.
So, where do you stand in terms of repairs that have been happening to your basement, and are you guys planning to stay? Is that correct?
Yes, we had plenty of day, and FEMA helped us out a little bit, which was great on their part, and we got another organization helping us with drywall, which is great, and every little bit helps nowadays, but we still haven't done any work on the basement. We're just trying to get the basics done, the plumbing, the washer and dryer all set up and stuff like that. Taking us a year, and we have a wall that's bent that we had to screw in every month to straighten out the wall. So that's been taking us a while to do too.
Okay. And do you think that'll be done yet this year? Or do you know roughly when, hopefully, hope to get the basement all back to where it was? And are you waiting on FEMA money, or have you got everything that FEMA's going to be giving? Or if you don't mind me asking that.
Oh, we've got everything we're gonna get. I think we just gotta do it ourselves now.
How did the past year go for you besides that? Like, did that really knock you sideways, or how did you?
Well, yeah, moved for a loop here. We didn't know what was going on, and we lost all that living space and all that storage space, and um, I now half of my basement is sitting in my dining room, and it's pain in the butt trying to look around it and everything. We know why it's there, and everybody else knows why it's there. That we'd like to get back to a regular living arrangement again.
Okay. And then how have you and your husband done? I guess emotionally, if you don't mind me asking that question as well. I mean, this could be really devastating in certain ways. How have you dealt with that, and how are you feeling basically a year later?
Good about everything. It's just gonna take longer than we thought. My husband and I are doing fine. The house is doing fine. We just trying to get everything back in place. We got a cement floor that we have a concrete floor that we got to get back in place to start out the other place, start all the walls and everything like that. Once you get the floor started, then we can get work will go pretty fast.
Okay. And thank you, Karen. A couple more questions. So we're a year after the flooding event. How much is this on the minds of people in Spencer? Like, when you talk to friends and coworkers and such, is this still something that is a topic that people, talk about and want to share about?
Sure. Mhm. I would say for sure, especially people that are impacted by the flood. The people that are not impacted by the flood is not so much because they don't. It didn't devastate part of the living, and say it didn't devastate part of their house, and it's not as impactful on them as it is the people that have been affected by the flood.
How do you feel like the city officials have done? So there's like FEMA from the National Emergency Management. How do you feel like the local officials in like Spencer City Council, et cetera? How have they done?
We got a little bit of money from them, and we appreciate that. I wish there was more to go towards, supplies and stuff. The support wise, it's been there. They're doing things to help raise money, I guess, and like concerts for the flood and stuff. And um, it just we wish that there was more. In the beginning, there was more, emergency food, emergency services, emergency this stuff, but just nothing to help us now.
And then final question: have you been through a natural disaster before, and like how does this compare?
Marshalltown tornado when it hit in 90, I don't remember when it hit, a couple years, 2018. Um, yeah, it's like, it's a shame too with that. I got PTSD from the the Marshalltown tornado, and I didn't get it as bad here because it wasn't as bad as a situation for me. But I got a little bit of PTSD from that, just overwhelming thoughts from when I see messages and stuff. It's kind of overwhelming for me.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate the time here. Best wishes to getting that basement back to the way that you want it to be, and moving forward, and as you kind of remake your home there in Spencer.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
And that's a wrap for this edition of What's This Frequency? As we look back one year later at the devastating floods of June 2024 throughout much of Siouxland, where I spent the day in Spencer, Iowa. Thanks much to my two guests from City Hall. We had Spencer City Manager Kevin Robinson and Clay County Emergency Management Director Eric Tigas And then also I spoke with Spencer resident Karen Uveling. As we move deeper into a second year for the show, thanks for being a part of our station as we work every day to tell the stories about Siouxland that inform, entertain, and expand the mind. Thanks for listening, and please join us again next week. What's the Frequency airs on Fridays at 10 a.m. and again on Sundays at 2 p.m. Make sure you also check out a few of our Siouxland Public Media music shows that air at 10 p.m., as we have Hip Hop Chronicles on Thursdays, Mixtape Dance Parties on Fridays, and 10 o'clock Blues on Saturdays. For Siouxland Public Media, I'm Brett Hayworth.